and welcome to the Wood Carbon Seminars. This is the follow-up discussion session to the fourth presentation in the webinar series called Wood in the Building Industry. This is the last session in the webinar series. My name is Monica Huang and I work for the Carbon Leadership Forum. I'm the one who's coordinating these webinars, and I'm going to go over some introductory logistics before we start. Here's the agenda for today. I'll go over logistics, the disclaimer, an introduction to the Carbon Leadership Forum, and then pass it on to Kate. We'll have a quick presentation today by Edie, Sonne to go over what we've learned in the webinar series. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. We will publish the recording online. All attendees should be muted, so please do not unmute yourself or share your screen or share your webcam. If you have a question for the speakers, you can enter your question into the chat box directed to Kate. We'll collect questions from the chat log after the webinar. We're planning to publish a Q&A document at the end of the seminar series, answering all of the questions submitted by the audience, or as many as possible, with the help of the speakers and or some other wood experts. I'll send out an email update when that's available. There are hundreds of questions, so it might take a while, but it's coming. Here's our disclaimer slide. I'll just pass you that. About us, the Carbon Leadership Forum is a nonprofit industry academic collaborative at the University of Washington. We are architects, engineers, contractors, material suppliers, building owners, and policymakers who work collaboratively, pioneering research, creating resources, and incubating member-led initiatives for greatest collective impact. Our goal is to accelerate transformation of the building sector to radically reduce and ultimately eliminate the embodied carbon in building materials and construction. We have an active online community with various focus groups with over 1,000 members and growing. And here's our sponsor slide. So thank you to the Carbon Leadership Forum sponsors. And now I'll hand it over to Kate Simonen, the director of the Carbon Leadership Forum and moderator for today's session.
Hello, Monica, and welcome everybody. As we're continuing on I would just say a challenging time, and it's a challenging time, a time that challenges us to really listen and learn from others. I want to take a moment to recognize where we're at, and I want to read a statement that we issued earlier this week in understanding and appreciation of the challenges that we're going through. We're living in an extraordinary moment in human history, as though the 1918 flu epidemic and the 29 market crash and the 1963 March on Washington during the Civil Rights era happened simultaneously. But we're doing this all in the context of the global existential crisis of climate change. And so it's worth asking how these recent events, including the COVID situation, the public murder of George Floyd, and the global protest against that murder have influenced our awareness of the structures of power and the privilege in which we live. The disastrous impacts of climate change are already felt most deeply by poor and marginalized communities of color around the world. This means climate change is fundamentally an issue of social and racial justice. We have, I'm gonna paraphrase myself a little bit here. So we have a significant impact, and we have a responsibility to address that. Many of us are indeed becoming painfully more aware of our roles in supporting structural inequality, and we live in a moment of exceptional emotional rawness. But what matters most not is how we feel, but what we do. And we at the Carbon Leadership Forum commit to listen, learn, and evolve in order to do our part to build the connections and community needed to redesign the social structures and examine assumptions that have enabled both racial oppression and carbon pollution. So this was part of a newsletter that we sent out this week around structural engineers action. We are looking forward to working with all of you to expand our capacity to support holistic solutions that enable social justice, equity, and decarbonization. I really want to emphasize the listen, learn, and evolve, and hope that we can all take these opportunities to hear more from more people in different ways than we've heard before. And thank you all for joining us in this journey. So in that listening and learning front, that has been one of the primary functions of these wood carbon seminars, is looking to learn from experts in forest and forest carbon. We've had this is the 8th of an 8-week series with alternating content and discussion. So we're in our discussion series now. And we're going to start our discussion with a little bit of a sharing overview by Edie Sonne Hall. Edie is a project advisor for this series, and she's been helping us organize and shape these webinars from the beginning. So we really thought it would be great for her to reflect on what we've learned so far and help tie it together before we move on to the discussion with David Diaz and Pat Layton. So Edie, could you please share your screen and unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you see my screen?
I see all of your screen, and maybe even your email if you're not careful.
Okay, here we go. Let's share something else. How about, where did my, it's interesting because it just came up. Here it is. You know, this is really interesting because I've been following along on all of these and just been so impressed by everyone's technical, lack of technical glitches. And of course, I'm the one that ends up having a hard time with this. So now can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks, Kate, for putting some thoughts to words to describe this really unprecedented time and devotion to that we all feel and we all need to know about, devotion to deeper learning and understanding. So I appreciate the time to pause and reflect and think. So with that, my name is Edie Sonne Hall, and I'm the founder and principal of 3 Trees Consulting. I work on projects that bridge the gap between science and management and policy, with a specialty in forest carbon accounting and life cycle assessment. I've been helping put together this webinar series, and I'm going to attempt to provide a very high-level summary of the webinars thus far. You should definitely consult the course website for all of the excellent speaker presentations as you prepare for the test that we will be giving after this webinar. Just joking. Okay, so we had 2 goals for this webinar series. The first was to have a shared understanding of what is included in a wood product EPD and what is not and why, and to understand more about where wood building products are manufactured and where and how trees are grown. If you've gotten anything out of this series, hopefully it's an appreciation that forest carbon dynamics are complex. Hence the reason why we had to devote 8 webinars to get everyone to a shared understanding. Our second goal is to use this series and the discussions that come out of it to brainstorm how we can better connect the forest sector information to builders and builders and architects. And as Kate mentioned last week, this is a process, not a conclusion. So let's kind of recap what we've learned so far. The first 2 webinars were intended to give you a primer on forest and forest product manufacturing in the US. Hopefully, we now all appreciate that forests are owned by many different types of landowners, and in fact, the largest owner category in the US are small family landowners. The types of products that you are interested in, building materials, are most likely found in 2 regions in the US, either in the US South or the Pacific Coast. And just FYI, this production scale plays a global role. The US is the highest producer of industrial roundwood logs and the second highest producer of saw timber, though the highest country producer, China, does not source wood from its own country. In webinar 1, Cindy West introduced us to the biogenic carbon cycle and the introduction of a theme that was emphasized in pretty much every presentation. Forests can be sources of carbon emissions or sinks of carbon, and their contributions are impacted by a combination of nature, disturbances and environmental factors, preconditions, for example, the age of trees, and management. We also learned that the natural carbon cycle and the managed carbon cycle are both circles. But if there is a land use change, that circle is broken. Finally, we learned that these circles are hard to piece out at smaller scales, but things can be tracked over larger spaces and time. And what are these trends over time? So you could say that prior to significant human intervention at the landscape level, there was no net sequestration, meaning the growth and decay from forest were about equal. Now at smaller scales, that's not the case. At smaller scales, you can have some forests that say have reached the end of their growth curve and are just hanging out. So there's a little growth offset by decay. And then you can have some that have just had a fire or a wind blow and are source of emissions, and then others that are growing vigorously as a regrowth from a previous disturbance. But overall, there is no net sequestration. Then you had the great transfer of carbon stock forest in the 1700s and 1800s, largely caused by conversion of land to agriculture and for the past 100 years, we've largely been in a regrowth phase, and those net emissions have become a large net sink since the 1950s. The US Forest Service, however, predicts this sink will diminish due to increased fire in overstocked forest and fire-prone regions and land conversion for development, with the largest risk in the US South. Okay, moving on to webinars 3 and 4. In webinar 3 and 4, we dove into the nitty-gritty of how biogenic carbon gets treated in wood. Reed Miner explained carbon neutrality and the different options for determining whether there is the zero net impact of carbon from a product system. How do you calculate that? From a tree before it grew, from the tree after it was harvested, from the net change in carbon on the landscape, which is how a mill would source its fiber. We learned from James Salazar that the current wood EPDs follow guidance from ISO 21930 to look at a landscape, which requires you to look at the country of origin's carbon stock to see if they are stable or increasing, or alternatively, if the wood comes from a certified forest. So then we confirmed that in fact biogenic carbon is tracked and reported in the EPD, but it is designed such that in a cradle to gate EPD, there is no way to report net sequestration, only to confirm there is not net emissions. This is true for both the land side as well as the long-term storage in a product. So if you want an idea of the long-term storage in a harvested wood product, there are tools with which to estimate these values, and these are often reported separately in the additional information section of an EPD. Also in webinars 3 and 4, Elaine O'Neill brought us back to a little more understanding and appreciating the nuances of forests. She showed here the major wood producing regions up above are increasing in inventory, which correlates to carbon stocks. They are doing this at the same time that they are stable or increasing harvest levels, which underscores another theme in this series of the importance of wood product demand to drive investment in forest planting and management. Other places have fairly stable carbon stocks over time, but as you can see, and this was another theme, in the Rocky Mountain softwoods, mainly driven by beetles and fire, the stocks are in decline. And speaking of stocks, In webinars 5 and 6, we learned the difference between carbon stock, i.e. how much carbon there is out there in the forest, and carbon flux, the change in carbon stock from one year to the next. We learned that the Forest Service has been physically measuring sample plots across the entire country for the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, FIA, that was started in 1930. These samples get rolled up into national level greenhouse gas inventory that gets reported to the IPCC every year. In addition to national level data, there is a wealth of information related to trends on different land, impacts on growth, mortality, and harvest in different regions. And now there is also state level data. And again, Grant Domke showed a little highlight on the state level data. This graph here shows that most states have forests that are net sink, which is the area highlighted under the line. Save for the Intermountain West, which we have already discussed, related to issues with fire and insects. In webinars 5 and 6, we also learned about some complementary information that we have to understand more about wood and where and how it is grown. Lauren Cooper gave an overview of sustainable forest certification and fiber sourcing certification. Sustainable forest certification is based on principles that promote sustainable yield, water quality, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and protection of forests with exceptional conservation values. And again, she highlighted yet another theme from this series, that we were reminded that carbon is one of only many ecosystem services that are provided by a forest. The US has about 95 million acres of certified forests, about 19% of total timberland, which is almost twice as much as the global average of 11% of certified forests. But if a forest is not certified, that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't sustainable. And given the large number of small family forest landowners, there had to be a way to provide assurances for the fiber that is uncertified. That's where controlled wood and wood fiber sourcing certification come in. And finally, Lauren pointed out that all states have best management practices around water quality, regeneration, soil erosion, etc. And some states have these codified in forest practices regulations. So last week, Pat gave us an overview of the process and economics associated with fiber flow from forest to frame. And David provided some exploration for applying forest carbon changes to the product level. And then it explained the nuances, the complex nuances associated with those numbers. And we are going to continue that discussion today. So in conclusion, I really hope you've learned something for these webinars so far. We have really appreciated all of the specific questions that have been submitted, and we are committed to working through and answering those questions. As Monica mentioned, we will be publishing these as a master FAQ after the series is over. I really want to give a big shout out to Kate and Monica for organizing this, and to all the speakers who so eloquently and passionately contributed to this great series. So I'm going to stop my screen and bring it back to, I think, Kate.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Edie. And we have to make sure and give a good shout out. Thank you to you as well for all of your help throughout this process. It's been great having you here. So I'm now inviting in David Diaz, Pat Layton, and Edie to share your screens. And I just want to let the audience know that if you want to, if you're looking at it in gallery view or speaker view, you can go up and there's a little dot next to your name, and you can highlight and say that you want to only see the speaker videos. So, or you can go into your video settings. There's a way of hide anybody who's not speaking if you want us to be big on your screen, so you can really feel like we're all in the same room together. So thank you everybody for coming here and joining for this discussion. I think that there's two big themes that I would like to talk about today. So one is around chain of custody and things around that. And then the other is this carbon smart versus climate smart discussion. So I think I want to start first on the chain of custody, because I found out something really interesting last time about the stamp on the wood that goes to the mill. We've talked a lot about whether or not there is supply chain accountability. And so I just wanted to confirm that that's really the case, Pat, that if I go to, if I get my 2x4 from Home Depot, there's going to be a stamp on it. And I'm used to the stamp from the grading perspective. And that you pointed out there was a mill number. So how would I actually find out what mill that was? Is there a master list of mills somewhere, or?
Correct. And usually the grading authority for each region has that master list of mills. And I think they're public knowledge. So it would be just checking with your grading authority, and their symbol is on that stamp too.
So I'm used to the Western Wood Products Association.
And then SPIB, it was the Southern one.
Okay, and so that's and those are the organizations that go and certify the strengths of the grades of the lumber.
Yes, and there are some other auditors of those, but SPIB and Western Wood Products always set up the standards, go through a standards grading process. They don't necessarily grade every individual mill, but it's their standards that are being used. And so the same kind of thing is going to be on each thing so that you can identify a mill. You can even go out and look at telephone poles and see, or utility poles, and see who made those and who graded those and stuff like that. Okay,
so that could be like a fun educational thing to do with my kids today. We could search for wooden. Actually, I have a pole out in my front yard. So
you can look.
Go check it out. Okay, but then that would tell us the mill itself.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily tell the forest, but you talked a lot about forest baskets. If I know the mill, I'm kind of going to know the region of the forest. Is that almost a guarantee?
Correct. And if you know the mill, then you can find out if they have a chain of custody certification. So that may be on the wood itself. For example, if it's an SFI type product or an FSC product, they may actually be stamped on there. But if you wanted to learn more about the wood basket, yeah, you just look up the location of the wood of the mill, and you can learn about the mill and where they're, think about drawing a circle 50 to 70 miles around it. And that's where the majority of their wood's going to come from.
So when you say chain of custody certification, a mill, what is that doing beyond that, the mill?
Okay, so there's forest management standards, and then there's how the wood is managed after or handled after it gets to the mill, so that it goes all the way to the distributor and down into local dealers, so that you know and can pass on exactly who had it and how it passed from one owner to the next, or in the distribution system.
So the stamp will tell us the mill. The chain of custody tells that people are passing them on.
Yeah.
Who they're passing it to. And so if you're doing that chain of custody, that must be required for the certified lumbers, so that you don't people aren't mixing it up. That's the key thing, is that you're not trying to, that you know that you're not somehow magically creating more certified lumber than you started out with.
Correct. And your distributor can probably give you that information.
But that doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us whether or not anything about the forest management itself. It just tells us that chain of custody tells how it's passed through, and then that chain of custody could link to a management practice.
Yes.
So if would I be able to tell what state it's from?
If you know the mill, yes. Each mill within the system has an individual ID. So for example, if there are 4 mills in your state owned by the same company, each has a different mill ID.
So I would start to be able to tell whether or not it's done from Washington wood versus Oregon wood if I decided that I wanted to incentivize Washington wood, although there might be people at the border that are sharing wood across the border.
Absolutely, and wood does go across borders.
Okay.
And out the country too.
So I'm curious, Edie or David, do you have any thoughts about this chain of custody? Because this keeps coming up as a discussion about wood products that with steel products, we have a mill certification and we know exactly what mill it is. And is there, and feeling like we don't understand as much about the supply chain of wood. Do you have anything else to add?
Just to add to that, I think that grade stamp is super helpful. There is a lot of information relative to whether or not a mill is certified either control wood or fiber sourcing, which gets at sort of that larger aspect of what is coming into what type of fiber is coming into my mill, whether or not it's actually certified or not. So there's a level of assurances that are associated with that. And then the chain of custody tracks the actual percentage of certified material that is coming from one of these forest management certification systems. And so it gives you two levels of information that I think are equally useful, that can be tracked at the mill level.
So are you saying that fiber sourcing, a mill can, if a mill is fiber source certified, that means they pay attention to where their wood is coming from? It doesn't mean they've done a good job of it, they just pay attention.
Well, so they each certification system has slightly different strategies. So SFI's fiber sourcing certification requires across all lands, whether they're certified or not, that the harvest is done by trained loggers, and that really gets at making sure that you're not scarfing trees and where your endangered species are, and you have riparian buffers and kind of all of the things that are associated with a good harvest level. It also now requires that the wood, that BMPs are enforced, water quality BMPs. So those are like riparian buffers, etc. And also that the wood is not coming from an illegal source, etc. The FSC's control wood does a risk assessment across the landscape to make sure that the risk that the wood is coming from land that's been converted to another use, genetically modified wood, illegal wood, wood that's been harvested in conflict with some sort of social unrest, or that there's any sort of impact to high conservation value forest, that there is a very low risk that the wood that you are sourcing are coming in. So both of them do not just say I'm paying attention to it, but I'm taking steps to assure that the wood that's coming in here it meets a certain bar.
And I keep getting confused. I have to just say, is fiber sourcing certification the same as certified wood? They're different.
Yes, they're
different. So I know I've heard this like 3 times, so I'm feeling a little dense, but I'm just trying to understand what's the difference between certified wood and fiber source certification.
Think of it this way: the fiber sourcing certification, the mill gets certified, and the mill has to prove all of these things, and they have to provide what their outreach is to all of the landowners that are not them, that they're getting their wood from. Certified wood is the forest land, and so those can be 2 totally different companies that are getting certified.
So if I'm a company and I make glue laminated beams, I could get fiber sourcing certification and actually not purchase any wood from certified forests.
You could, yes. That could be a part of it. Yeah.
Because I'm certified that I'm doing all the things as a mill to act out, but my wood itself might not be certified.
Yeah, but your label, you wouldn't have a label. So there are two different labels, and this is getting into some nuances. Maybe we have a separate seminar about what the labels mean, but your label is not going to say it comes from a certified forest. It's going to say that it is, I'm not exactly sure. Each one has a
So
separate.
if I asked for SFI wood or FSC wood, and my mill had fiber sourcing certification, they might not be able to provide me any because they might not have any wood available.
Yes, but most most mills have some sort of certified wood that's coming through them, so they can.
I mean, that would sort of, it would make sense if you were you would, that would be sort of a package that you get some of your certified lumber coming in and you get fiber sourcing certification as a mill.
Exactly.
Could you skip that last step of fiber sourcing certification, or is that required to make the chain of custody work for certified lumber?
That's a good question. I don't
Okay,
know.
Does anybody know that answer?
No, I'm not going to say for sure for all standards. So.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, Kate, I will add, you know, in terms of how far up the supply chain can you go in terms of tracing. I think Pat did a good job of describing that. Basically, if you look around, you know, about 75 miles, radius around a mill, you're probably capturing the majority of that mill's wood supply. If you're on a border, then obviously you're going into multiple states like that. But there are definitely cases that I've been involved with where the best job that you can do, we were working with a builder that acquired FSC certified wood from California, and the mill said, well, it came from California, Oregon, or Idaho. So, there's definitely kind of some transparency that's limited up the supply chain based on where the wood is coming to the mill from, and they may be able to tell you generally this is our wood supply area, but there's definitely some that kind of numbers tracing a log from the forest of origin through the mill do not currently, it's not common practice to do that.
Okay, so I guess it just depends on how comfortable you are with the level of specificity. Like, do you really want to know exact location, or do you want to know that you're leaning towards different management practices? Again,
it would be very difficult if it came on a truck, a log came in a truck from a specific landowner. They know that because there's a ticket that comes into when it crosses the scale. Then it gets into the log pile, and it may get right off the truck and go straight to the debarker. But once we start cutting that log apart and into pieces, it will get sorted numerous different ways. So that's where we sort of have to lose some of that, and we do it by percentages of the wood coming into that particular mill. Because I can't, once it gets sorted and cut and sawn, I can't put the wood from that one log back together again. We don't mark them individually.
So that would be probably similar to a pile of iron ore that comes in. They're getting
yes.
it from mines.
Yes.
They put them into a big old pile, and nobody's making 15 different piles for those different things. You wouldn't.
Correct. But most mills, sawmills, primary mills, know who they bought from, because they have to issue tickets out and pay people for what they bought. So there is the opportunity to know that. In my state, for example, the landowner gets a copy of what came into the mill from their specific land. The mills have to mail that back out to those landowners. So the landowner knows if their wood got to the mill.
Okay. Okay. Anything else right here on this topic that you guys want to add in before I shift a little bit? Okay. I want to shift to regional differences, because Pat, I learned a lot about the Southeast in your presentation, which is not an area that I know that much about, so that I found that really interesting. And I'm curious, when we keep showing the U.S. map, I somehow imagine the Pacific Northwest bubbles up through Vancouver, but I keep hearing that there's also the Northeast in Canada that also provides structural lumber. So am I right in terms of the big North American wood production lumbers? It's the Northeast, the Northwest, and the Southeast?
Yeah, and there's some in the lake states, but less. So the spruce firs of the Northeast had tended to go into the pulp and paper market, but that has somewhat disappeared. And so there are increasing numbers, we hope, of sawmills in that area able to take advantage and use that wood. Certainly out of Canada, there are sawmills for spruce fir in that area also. But there are also large pulp and paper industries there too that have using that wood also. So it is, but they are all, most of the certifications cover the whole of the United States and Canada in one form or another, so that you can feel competent in North America if you're buying wood in North America that you've got well-managed forest and you've got chain of custody kinds of systems for all that wood.
So I've heard, so you made a statement about general confidence, and that's probably one of the most controversial kind of statements that we get, that like how generalizable are these confidence issues? We've talked a lot about US. We haven't talked as much about Canada, and I keep getting questions about, what I heard the story of the Southeast sounds about reforesting farmland and bringing that back up. Where I hear stories of the Northeast Canada that there is primary forests that have not ever been converted that are starting to be harvested, and then we have forests that are in there's multiple generations here of harvest in the Pacific Northwest, but they weren't converted to farmland. So it does seem, so I guess broad picture, those big regional differences make a difference.
Correct. That doesn't mean that forests haven't been disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you were in Maine, they are on like their third or fourth forest because parts of it was harvested for farmland, and parts of it has just been harvested over time since the European settlement for providing wood for the world. They were a great exporter of logs. And the same thing happened in Canada. There was a great export of wood out of there in some parts. The Canadian, both provincial and federal governments have allowable or areas that they allocate to specific mills. And those mills have an annual allowable cut, and that goes across all of the federal and provincial lands in Canada, if I'm correct. And Edie, you can nod your head to say yes. And so they govern that. And however, with the impetus of, so for example, in Canada, there may not have been as much attendance several decades ago to reforestation of those areas or green up of a cut, whereas now under SFI and FSC kinds of certification systems, there's more attention to making sure that we've hit a target of when a green up would have happened or a new reforestation would have happened. So we've changed over the last 25 to 30 years with those, but yeah, so there is oversight.
And Kate, if I can just add to this sort of underscores that I think we sort of touched on it really across all of the webinars, but this input of a combination of both sort of the precondition of the stand. You mentioned sort of the broad area, like, reforestation back from an ag land versus still converting from a primary forest to a non-forest to areas that are in their third or fourth generation of rotation. That contributes, just as much as, if not more, to your relative carbon stock than, for example, the nature. So disturbances are huge. I mean, and especially in Canada. Canada is either going to be a huge source of emissions or a huge sink of emissions, depending on whether or not there's a big fire year or insect damage, just due to the nature of just this vast amount of forest that is largely not managed relative to the great area. In any given year, I don't know the statistic for Canada. In the US, it's, I think, an average of 1.6% of the area is harvested. So the rest of it is subject to the whim of what's happening to nature and to where you are in your growth phase.
Well, so I think this ties. So I want to make sure and go back to the other discussion because but I still have some other questions there. When we started this seminar series, we talked about carbon smart versus climate smart forestry. And it's interesting. I've been teaching an LCA class at the University of Washington, and we brought that up, and the students asked me, and I didn't even have an answer what the difference was at the start of the quarter. So I think I get it now. It's in particular when we've been looking. So David, I want to try and summarize it, and you tell me if I've got it right. So when we've been looking at these carbon fluxes, and it's exciting for us as architects and engineers to incentivize forest management that increases the rate of carbon storage on a landscape and in products. So we think that we should only want to purchase wood from forests that are increasing in stock, and that would be a carbon smart decision, that we wouldn't want to decrease the carbon stock in a region. But then we saw some stuff about Colorado, where Colorado is radically decreasing carbon stock. And there might be a condition in Colorado where incentivizing forest management might actually be a climate smart decision. It would help do forest fire restoration. But even in the near term, we might still see a decline in carbon stock in that area. Is that the kind of distinction that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's just to recognize that carbon is one indicator that you might be interested in from forests. I mean, prior to the recognition of the climate crisis, we had certification systems for forest management and forest practice regulations in many states, recognizing that this kind of what scientists call, ecosystem services, whether that's, water quality, soil conservation, biodiversity, habitat for fish and wildlife, things like that. And these are all, more, in my opinion, more significant reasons to be concerned about forests that need to be part of the consideration when you're thinking about directing wood purchasing to influence the climate and responses to the climate. And so this is a great example where there are some places where the climate smart thing to do for a forest may actually be releasing carbon to the atmosphere. And so I think it's just important that, asking, because it's relatively easier to quantify, asking about those carbon impacts is a good place to start. But if you have a negative carbon number or a carbon emissions number associated with that, it shouldn't be the end of it. It should be, an encouragement for you to ask questions. Is there a reason, that there's a climate smart justification for actually reducing carbon stocking on the land related to these other things that we care about from forests? And so that's where I think it leads you back into the realm of some of the certifications that try to deal with this broader suite of forest values that you care about. And then there's also some additional, if you really want quantitative information in the same sense that you get an EPD that has a variety of different indicators, for ozone, in addition to global warming potential and all of that. The closest that I've seen to that right now are either things that are done voluntarily by companies in sustainability reporting. There's a variety of timber companies that do issue annual sustainability reports that have these other indicators. But in terms of third-party certification, there's a in the carbon markets, there was a program called the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard that's used essentially to layer on top of carbon offsetting. So it doesn't generate carbon offsets, but it says you've used a third-party defensible method for calculating climate, community, and biodiversity benefits. And then within FSC, there's a new ecosystem services procedure that's only been piloted so far. It hasn't seen widespread adoption yet, but it's a similar process of quantify the biodiversity contribution.
Oh, David is in an internet zone. So
I will say SFI is also in the midst of redoing its standards, and some of these issues are being proposed for new standards on within SFI. So there are changes and upgrades to all of these standards through time, and that's part of the standards making process. And that's why we love about standards making processes. It's not one thing. It can change and grow and impact and be a part of where we're guiding and how we're guiding. And I think that's the wonderful thing about all of these systems, is that they do change and grow and recognize what we need and our social needs as well as our scientific needs.
Okay, I still want to go back to the I want to keep going back to your Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
You had a circle here.
Yeah.
That was climate smart forestry. And then you had another one that was carbon smart forestry. And you overlapped them like a little teeny bit. Is that just, that's how Venn diagrams always go?
That's right. Yeah, I do have a little note there that says not drawn to scale. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that that amount of overlap is going to change from ecosystem to ecosystem. So this is where it's not going to make your life easy as a wood purchaser to know that how much overlap there is. But I think a good starting place, like I said, would be if you can get access to information about, is the wood certified, as much as you can get about where did which forests that came from and what are the management practices and systems that those landowners use. You can start to get closer to this, but there's not going to be a simple nutrition sheet, at least for the next several years. I think there's still a lot of work to develop these quantification approaches to get quantitative indications like that. And so I think carbon is usually the first place where we see things like this starting. But there is movement to add in other quantitative indicators that you can layer on top of certification as well.
For example, I'm an old geneticist, a tree breeder. So since the 1950s and especially into the 60s and 70s, we've been breeding southern yellow pine trees to increase their growth. So if we did nothing, but we used better material, genetic material, we got bigger trees and more carbon sequestration simply because we were able to use enhanced or breed better trees so that we got more yield, so more growth per tree. And then when we tie into that, some of the other things we've done and understood, we're getting more growth, so more carbon sequestration per acre. And it's just simple genetics. And the same thing's been done with Doug fir out there. So your trees are growing faster, sequestering more carbon per acre simply by doing a few things like using parents that are faster or better growing, straighter, more resistant to disease and insects kinds of trees. So simple things like that have done an amazing amount to sequester carbon over the last 50 years.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, maybe that Venn diagram sort of underrepresented that overlap between climate smart and carbon smart. But I would be fairly optimistic to say that in the long term, the focus, which was really what climate smart is the focus on healthy, productive, resilient forests. Mm-hmm. That's going to ultimately be the climate smart solution as well, or sorry, the carbon smart solution as well. And the classic example is in fires, where there is situations, and it is completely specific to the region, and in fact the preconditions, whether or not they're overstocked right now, whether or not they're in an area that has a natural fire return interval that is high and is getting higher. Those are the places where it might make sense right now to go in and reduce the carbon stock, which in theory would be opposite to what atmosphere, reducing the carbon stock would see, but it is intended to prevent that stand replacing fire. So the ultimate emissions due to fire, which is very hard to predict, you know, that it's going to happen on a particular landscape, and how do you quantify it, and all of these things. But sort of ultimately that will impact the reduction of atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of how I like to think of it, of like a strategy that's focusing on having a healthy, productive, resilient forest. You're really not going to go wrong.
Well, and I would add to that I think the concerns around resiliency are not even limited to the ecosystem. So obviously this is where I think the livelihoods of people that are working in and around the forest is also very important. And so this is where I think I don't want wood buyers or builders to come away from this and saying, oh, it looks like in a lot of these dry forests, you know, east of the Cascades or in the Intermountain West, there's a lot of carbon stock being lost. I shouldn't buy wood from there. That's you know, what's going to happen if that were the case was that the markets to actually allow restoration that's legitimate, you know, restoring ecosystem functioning and resilience would have no markets. And so we'd already see more divestment than has already been the case in the absence of that concern. So you don't want to further that process. So I think supporting restoration activities based on some justification you can make, you know, as a wood buyer, you still need to, if you are trying to advance climate smart practices, you do need to be able to say, is this just liquidation of a forest in an area, or is there actually ecosystem restoration that's occurring?
Correct.
So
we know that through certification. Would that certification tell us that?
It points you in that direction. But so this is where you're going to have to read more and ask more about which forests the wood came from and the practices that are going on there, and probably actually have someone that understands.
It's hard. How we're having to do so much as architects and builders. I'm just going to complain a little bit. How, I mean, so like, yeah, because
so a lot of that is federal or state controlled land in a lot of that region. It's not private land as much. So there are opportunities to get that data and understand that data. And I think it's really important to just recognize that your state forestry organization, your state forester, is responsible for kind of helping you understand and get that information from you. And in fact, I'd rather see a new sawmill going in some of those places to help, so that we actually use that product and it gets stored in carbon. So I don't want to seem that you have to go dig, but it is, if you know it's coming from that region, or if there is a mill or something in that region, it's okay to call out the state forester or go look at their website, because they have that kind of information on their websites.
So maybe what I'm hearing here is that it actually is, how do we influence change? And one way that we influence change is how we specify wood products. And another way that we could influence change is in terms of the legal status of the forests, or how they're managed or understood. So that maybe to only assume that our lever is through our specification procurement is a little limited, because the other way is it, I mean, I think that would be a political position, right? Is what the laws are.
Yeah, and I would add a third way too. And the third way is direct investment in ecosystem service markets, carbon markets, insetting within your supply chain. Those are the ways that are actually getting at the actual change that could be a result of avoiding emissions, you know, if it's down a pathway, or it could be a result of actually increasing sequestration beyond what would have happened. But if that's what you're interested in.
Is that like the things I see big companies invest in a forest and do? So what are these ecosystem services? Is there some sort of like ecosystem service credit bureau that you can just buy?
Well, now we need a new 8-week webinar series.
Yeah.
So
They exist.
There are lots of them, and there are lots of ideas out as to how to make them interact with each other, how to bundle services together. There's some pretty established but also evolving markets related to carbon. There's wetland mitigation banking markets. There's some habitat conservation markets. There's water quality markets. There's a lot that's out there, and it is an ever evolving and ever improving sort of place to try to direct change and improvement.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that I would add to this as well is that I think the wood purchasers and builders have the opportunity to influence what is being measured and recorded by asking questions about where the wood came from, how the forests that produced it were being managed, and whether there's actually any verified documentation of that. So I don't think there's a real clear sense yet from the building community, what are the forest values that you care about, that you want to see reported on clearly. So I think there's something that as a forester, I could tell you, I want to report on carbon stocking, fire risk, wood supply, employment, biodiversity, soil conservation, things like that. But what's going to come out of that is the same kind of thing I see in a lot of EPDs right now, which is 12 indicators and builders use one, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a kind of meeting at the middle that needs to happen here, to where I think there's a kind of a statement of values that need to be reflected in the types of questions that builders are asking up the supply chain, and for there to be some value that a mill or a distributor sees in actually collecting and maintaining that information over time. Because I think there's still a disconnect right now in terms of, I want this type of wood, and a mill may not see value in actually collecting that information to provide you that type of information at that level of detail.
Okay, well, we're right up at time here. So I have to, we could keep, it sounds like we're ready for our next 8-week seminar in the future. So I just want to thank our guests here and all the guests who participated, as well as the broad sponsorship of the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, who've helped us advance this open access database of environmental product declarations, and in particular, the American Wood Council and Google, who helped us do a deep dive into biogenic carbon and the potential of connecting forest carbon accounting to forest product. I sure learned a lot, and I really appreciated that. And I'm looking forward to getting the questions that we can have answered, and identify the questions that we still have that we don't have the answers identified, and so that we can work together to figure out how to bridge those things. Because I think if we step back of a shared goal, we all are looking for a healthy, happy, equitable planet for ourselves and for generations to come. And biogenic materials has a lot of potential as being this carbon storing, carbon sinking solution for building products. And so we want to make sure we get it right. So thank you all, and thank you all to all the participants. We'll have you on our mailing list, so you'll get some updates as we get some conclusions. I'll leave it the meeting open for another couple minutes if you have any last minute questions that you'd like to add into the chat. So thank you all. Bye-bye.